Morning or evening, wherever you may be, for this session on evidence in fast-paced policy environments. We have three fantastic speakers straddling inside governments and research outside, and I hope we will keep this session quite fast-paced. It is being recorded, so be aware of that, and we have most of our views actually usually on the recordings of these as well as live. But those of you who are with us, do please use the chat function for comments or questions or links to materials you think might be most useful. There will also be time for comment and questioning after our speakers have spoken. And thank you as well for the various people who've already offered some thoughts and questions to look at, including how to ensure you have a proper diversity of inputs during crises, in a way that the starting point for this whole session is that in a very rapidly moving environment, people are very stressed. They don't have much bandwidth for coping with too much complexity, very long reports, lots of nuance. So things have to be made simple and digestible. And I think an issue we will explore through many different angles is, how do you weigh up the need for more knowledge or more research with the pressure to act? How do you weigh up the costs of not acting, the costs of omission, as it were, and the costs of acting with imperfect information? And these are, in some ways, very present dilemmas in every government, but also many businesses as they cope with different kinds of crisis, from the very obvious one we've all been through in the last few years with the pandemic and future pandemics, but also natural disasters, wars, financial crashes, or for that matter, political crises, which almost generate their own pace, even if external events are not causing them. So I hope that's what you were expecting to be discussing here. And as I say, we've got fantastic speakers, and let's also ensure we tap into the collective wisdom and knowledge of all of you taking part. So our first speaker is Eleanor Williams, who I work very closely with, who is currently based in the Australian government in Canberra, a background in Victoria, and is working, researching exactly this question. So Eleanor, over to you, and you will share your screen with us, I hope.
I will. I will share my screen in just one moment. But thank you for that introduction. That's a very thorough kind of summary of the context that we work in. And just by way of my own context, I did want to say, I am currently working in the Australian government, heading up something called the Australian Centre for Evaluation. But prior to that, I've worked on both sides of the fence. So I have worked as a policymaker and as an evidence generator in the fast-paced policy environments. And particularly on the policy side, I was involved in the 2008 Black Saturday bushfire response in Australia, which was a pretty substantial natural disaster, and more recently on the COVID-19 response in Victoria and Australia. But in between this, I've been involved in lots and lots of situations which are fast-paced policy environments, but not driven by those kind of crisis situations, but by other more standard kind of situations that come up in government. I did just briefly want to do a bit of a tour through some thinking I've been doing around this topic. Alongside my sort of policy involvement, I've also been doing quite a lot of research in recent years around evidence-based policy. And I think what at the core of a lot of evidence-based policy is this idea that ultimately the productive use of evidence is a combination of the supply of good quality evidence and the demand for the right evidence for the question that's at hand. And both these things are pretty substantially impacted when you get affected by time pressure. So on the supply side, there's actually a smaller, more limited set of things available to you as a policymaker when you're working at speed. But on the demand side, as Jeff sort of pointed out, you're working under this intense stress and pressure. And that means what you'll naturally think of to ask for will be limited by what you can think of and have the bandwidth to think about when you're working under these conditions. And in coming to this topic, I was really conscious too, there's not really an existing definition of fast-paced policy environments. I think that there's a lot out there in literature which gives a nod to the fact that lots of decisions are made on the fly, or that there's small policy windows to make decision. But what I wanted to capture in my research is to say, look, sometimes it will be driven by a crisis or emergency situation, but also pick up these situations where there's just intense public pressure to deliver a response, or there's been a really time-bound government commitment to act. And these things come up pretty frequently. Um, but in combination with that, you've also got this broader context that you'll be working under extraordinary policy timeframes. And here I say in less than 2 months, but I've talked to a lot of people involved in these processes who have to make some kind of policy response within a day or a week. So they're often much, much tighter than that. And the other characteristic I've been looking at is it being beyond the scope of existing capacity. So these aren't the situations where your standard policy team can tackle it in the timeframes available. You often end up bringing in either external experts or consultants or additional resources from inside government to make a response. So this is a sort of working definition I've been working towards. And this is just a brief summary. As I said, sometimes it's exogenous factors that are driving the fast-paced policy, but sometimes they're endogenous. Sometimes the government's driving them themselves. So this slide is really just to say, look, in addition to all those the crisis situations that we know of and have been sort of deeply studied, there's also both fully endogenous, where there's been an election commitment or a budget announcement that says government is going to act within this month to change something. Or there's things which are a combination of the two. Something exogenous has happened, there's a high profile incident, or it's a response to public concern, and government has therefore jumped in and said, well, we'll act quickly. And briefly, just what I wanted to flesh out in terms of my research, what I'm really coming up with is in terms of the factors that decide what evidence is useful when working under this time pressure, it's not just a matter of the characteristics of the evidence itself. So it's not just a matter of was it good, accessible information. It also depends on what the decision-making processes are. What is it that's allowing evidence to get into the decision-making process? And then the broader environmental factors. So decisions get made in departments and governments and bureaucracies. And ultimately, there's a question of, do the people involved in that process have the capabilities? Is there a culture of asking for evidence? And is evidence broadly valued and communicated and given a profile in the processes that you work on? Is that part of the institutional fabric? Do you have the right relationships with experts and advisors, for example? And then finally, I did just briefly want to touch on a bit of an early working hypothesis I have about what makes evidence useful in a fast-paced environment. And this is really just to say that and I'm conscious this is a busy slide too, so I'll just do a quick tour of it. But really what I'm finding is for evidence to be useful, it needs to both be quick to generate, but also easy to absorb. And so if you look at this diagram, and a quick sweep around it, starting with the top right-hand corner, what you're looking for is those evidence sources that people can get to you and that you'll be able to understand. And I particularly wanted to highlight in that square that there's a whole new sort of field of rapid reviews and rapid qualitative research where there's sort of a new field of researchers really focusing on, well, how do you make products that are rapid and robust rather than quick and dirty? And that's a big sort of mindset change that people need to go through in terms of thinking, well, just because it's generated quickly, could it actually be using strong principles? And I do think some of that work around rapid modeling and forecasting falls into that basket as well. If you build up real expertise about how to deliver those sorts of products quickly and with some high quality. In the other boxes on this diagram, I just did want to point out too. So on the left-hand top side, where we've got things that are quick to generate and hard to absorb, one of the things that's come up out in recent discussions and even in discussions that I've had just over this past week, things like broad brush literature scans have always been something you might be able to get together quite quickly, but they get quite complex and hard to communicate the key points when you're working at speed. But a few people have pointed out to me with advances in AI and that natural language processing, for example, we might actually get to the point where these sources move into that top right corner where all of a sudden you do have ways of making those products easier to absorb. Then below the line are the slower to generate products. The bottom left-hand corner are absolutely standard evidence products where you'd say, if you've got all the time in the world, you should do a systematic review and work out what's going to work in this situation. And what we've said here is that these need to be deprioritized till later. You absolutely should still continue this work, but it's not the sort of evidence source that you should go to when you're working at speed. It's unviable, and you'll probably be disappointed at how little progress you can make when you've got those time pressures. And then finally, there's some things in the world which are great if they're available. So these are the things that are slow to generate but easy to absorb. And one of the things I've highlighted there is things like a What Works toolkit. So say if you had an urgent need to respond to something like a literacy crisis in government, there's been a lot of work to synthesize all the knowledge around, well, what are the most cost effective and effective in achieving outcomes in that space. So you might be able to go to those toolkits and actually just have exactly what you need at that time. So in summary, this is a big part of my hypothesis around the evidence sources themselves. And at the moment, I'm trying to do a bit more research to say, well, once we know what sort of evidence sources are practical, which ones should feed into decision making, and how do we really get decision makers to make that bandwidth to use evidence effectively in these situations. So that's all I was going to cover today. Very keen to hear from the other speakers, so I'll hold there and hand back to Jeff.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, and we'll come back to all of those points later, including the practical prioritization in conditions of crisis. So our second speaker is Carrie Heitmeyer from the Government Office of Science. Carrie has obviously lived through some of this, as has Eleanor, but has also gathered together quite a few of the people from the UK evidence ecosystem, both within government and outside, to try and reflect on the lessons of the pandemic and elsewhere. So Carrie, over to you.
So thank you very much, Jeff, and it's great to be here. And this is a topic that's very close to my heart. And I think it feels like in the last few years, probably, at least, I mean, from my personal experience, but since COVID, there's been a lot more emphasis on this area of sort of rapid research. And it's great to see the work from other speakers, but also I know that IPPO has been heavily involved in this area as well. So this is a great opportunity to sort of bring sort of different experiences together. As Jeff mentioned, I'm Carrie Heitmeyer. I'm the head of social science in the UK Government Office for Science. And so I'll be focusing a bit more on the experience of sort of rapid science from the perspective of a user, sort of a broker, and sort of thinking also particularly from the perspective of social science for preparedness and emergency scenarios, and also the UK context. So just as a bit of background, the UK Government Office for Science, also as part of one of the areas that of responsibility, it also provides independent science advice for the government in the UK government in the event of an emergency. So this is something that we've been thinking a lot about both during COVID, which I'll speak to, as well as sort of post-COVID and learning from the COVID experience. And I think also I'll be focusing mostly on social science, but arguably I think there's many of these issues sort of are also applicable to other sort of natural sciences and other forms of evidence. Let's see. Oops. Oh, sorry. And I think just to start off on, I mean, I think it's important as well to sort of recognize the huge amount of diversity across the government in terms of how research is used and accessed. So within the UK government, we have the analytical professions, which help standardize how research is produced and commissioned internally, but also there are also sort of very different sort of research cultures, like from one department to the other. So there's always a bit of sort of tension in terms of both achieving that uniformity, but also having different research cultures in different departments, and also just to recognize as well sort of what we mean by rapid research. There's often a huge diversity, both in terms of again sort of how research is commissioned and translated, but also in terms of the sort of what we mean by rapid. So rapid can mean sort of a day, as Eleanor was saying, a day or a week, or sort of 3 months. and a piece of research that's recently been led by the Center for Science and Policy, the CSAP at Cambridge, has looked in a sort of quantitative and qualitative analysis of rapid research coming out of the UK government, and has found some really interesting patterns around, for example, FCDO has a much higher proportion of rapid research that it commissions versus some of the other departments, and also sort of again thinking about different what sort of time lengths meant by research. And then lastly, just what constitutes good evidence. There's also diversity in terms of quantitative, qualitative methodologies, et cetera. So just as an example of rapid science that I've been personally involved with, I worked with from June 2020 until early 2022 with SPI-B. So that's the Social and Behavioral Science subgroup for SAGE, which is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, which was stood up during the COVID, for the COVID response. And this was an independent UK social science group of UK social science experts across multiple disciplines, and would respond to rapid commissions from different UK government departments. So topics ranged from, many of you will be familiar with them, but behavior change to sort of how to communicate with different groups effectively, thinking about sort of impact of removing restrictions and how to sort of increase adherence. And all of this was sort of put together often sort of within a week or sort of few weeks to make sure that the sort of social science evidence could input into the wider sort of political decision making. And then I think the other thing that I've been involved with since then is one of the lessons that we learned during COVID was the importance of having mechanisms in place during peacetime, which could then be rapidly mobilized in the event of an emergency. And I think this is a really key part of rapid evidence and rapid science, as having done that thinking about sort of method and robustness, and how do you get the sort of tension, that tension and the balance right, and what are the methodologies that Eleanor was talking about, so that when the time comes, you have everything in place, whether it be that sort of expertise, the methods, and the sort of internal networks as well, to be able to rapidly mobilize the sort of resources at pace. So in this group in particular, sort of an internal government group, which is sort of trying to think proactively about what those sort of big issues are likely to be. What are the evidence gaps that we have internal to government that we need to think about addressing? How can we better liaise with funders around research mechanisms, and also think internationally. And so IPPO has actually been working with us as well in terms of helping us sort of think through and sort of review what are those sort of what are other international models that we can think about either adapting or sort of liaising with now, so that when in the event of an emergency, again, we sort of have everything in place. So just to sort of end on with a few final reflections, I think one of the points that is really critical, and I think this sort of both myself and other colleagues within Government Office for Science and other researchers as well, like IPPO, have been doing a lot of work around the sort of that knowledge brokerage aspect of embedding research into policy, and how critical, and I think often under considered, the labor that goes into actually doing that translation work, and how do we sort of strengthen that again, so that you have that sort of absorptive capacity within policy teams to be able to communicate effectively, but also sort of to think around evidence gaps in advance, and sort of liaise so that you can get the right evidence to the right people at the right time. And then I think just also the importance as well around co-production. So, and this again is sort of part of that knowledge brokerage piece, but I think having sort of trying to get away from, the sort of research questions come from the policy team, and then are sort of handed over to the researchers who then do the research, but working together and also building relationships of trust to be able to sort of go back and forth. And again, this is particularly difficult during sort of emergencies or crises, but I think is really sort of good practice, and particularly, but I think relationships of trust are really important in terms of underpinning that ability. And then I think finally, sort of, again, this is probably more broadly in terms of evidence in general and sort of embedding research and policy, but thinking beyond sort of written outputs and what are different formats that that policy audiences in particular will be able to sort of bring in that information at pace. So thinking about teach-ins, we also have a rapid roundtable function that we've developed in the last year in terms of bringing experts together quickly to sort of discuss and sort of talk through different the sort of evidence base as well as sort of different aspects, again, to sort of produce that sort of research at pace and sort of be able to then maximize the impact in the policy process. So I will end there.
Thank you very much, Carrie. And I think this point about the role of the brokerage, interpretation, sense making is absolutely key. Can you integrate the research providers and the users in more sort of intimate ways? And then are the key, in a sense, communications forms written, digital, or verbal? In fact, is a verbal culture often really important if you're in the midst of a crisis, hence rapid roundtables, control rooms, crisis centers, and so on, which are perhaps different from what you can do in slow-paced environments. We'll come back to those. So, Carrie, many thanks. And for those of you in the UK may have seen, actually, this week, there's been a bit of public debate and in the media about social science inputs during the pandemic, because I think it was the Academy of Social Science put something out. So our third speaker is Arjun Boyne from Leiden University, with again, a third country perspective and from a more university viewpoint. And I hope, Arjun, I hope you're ready you have some slides to share with us.
Yes, Jeff, I do. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Well, so thank you for inviting me. And I come from the world of crisis management and the research world that is. I don't manage crisis. I wouldn't be any good at it. But I've been studying for a long time, and I'm also very aware of the debates in the policy world about evidence-based decision making. So this is very interesting to see if we can bring that together. And let's see if so in my mind, where we come from, it's good to define these crisis situations and kind of set them apart from the sort of normal policy environments, however hectic they may be. And a pure crisis, if you will, is defined by that perception of threat, deep uncertainty, and urgency. So something needs to happen now. You got to make a decision, and you don't have what you want to know, and it's important. And the kind of distinctions that we make is between what we call a flash crisis, which is just really, think 9/11, you got to do something now, or a terrorist attack. And then we have the creeping crisis where, there's sort of politicized environment. There's more time, if you will. Or the protracted crisis, the crisis that drags on, like COVID. We talk about COVID a lot, but, that's a crisis that lasted for 2 years. So it kind of defies the whole idea of crisis, something that lasts for 2 years. And then it's very important, I think, to make a distinction between operational decision-making and strategic decision-making. We're mostly talking about the strategic domain, the policy domain. Evidence has a very different meaning in the operational domain. And we'll skip that for today, but it's good to remember that, I think. So if we look at the flash crisis, so the sort of the prototype of a crisis, the whole idea of evidence becomes moot, if you will. The uncertainty means you just don't know anything, and that's just the way it is. And the reflex of policymakers is always they can't handle this, so they always want to know more. They're going to look for whatever source of information, and any incoming information is then treated as evidence, which is not smart, because when we know, looking back, that much of the information that comes in the initial phase of a crisis turns out to be incorrect or incomplete in hindsight. Now, that creates the trap that policymakers refuse to move forward if they don't think they have enough evidence to make a very important decision. We call that decisional paralysis. So that is the pure crisis. That's not. I think we're talking a little bit about a different type of crisis. Well, I'll get to that in a second. So in this particular context, the solution, the strategy would be to just embrace uncertainty, and that sounds very fashionable. Embrace it like it's something fun, but in a way, it is liberating. I mean, if you just accept that you're not going to know, that's kind of, for policymakers, that is kind of cool, because you can now make a decision. And the challenge then is to pick the right decision. So not make decisions you should not be making right now. And then, you have choices how to approach that. You can pick between your value-based decision making. You pick a core value and use that as your guiding post, or you can adopt a more pragmatic, and I'm talking about the philosophical sense when I say pragmatic, and I'll get to that in a second. And the most important thing here is, if you realize that you don't know, you have to be ready to reverse course or adapt, because eventually more information will come in, and it's most unlikely that your first decisions will be the correct ones. So this is in a way going into a casino, but you don't know the odds, so it's worse. Fuzzy gamble, drawer used to call it. Let's the other ones that the policymakers are more familiar with, where time is a variable, often uncertainty is a variable, but still high. You get into the context where the decisions have to be made, but I heard one of the speakers say, "Oh, we had to do it within a week." Well, in the flash crisis, a week is close to eternity. In the policy world, a week is oh my God, we have to do this in a week. So this is how our perceptions of time can differ. Obviously, in this world, evidence will be politicized. The sense making is that way. It's still incomplete information. So the challenge then is to convince your audience that you have to make decisions that are not grounded in evidence or enough evidence, and that in and of itself is quite a challenge. And the reflex is to go to the experts, and we just the UK is a fantastic context of or networks of available experts, so that definitely is the way to go. But still, as we've seen also in COVID, that we have experts don't have all the answers. They're handy, but you have to know the limitations of that. So here, I think from where we come from, the pragmatic approach, which is if I summarize it in 30 seconds, which is very irresponsible, I would say you treat a situation like a hypothesis, and then use experiments. Your strategy is like an experiment, and you're testing whether your hypothesis of the situation is true. So this is all about organizing feedback loops, so you can discover what works and what doesn't work. And of course, experts are fantastic to involve in this kind of situation. And the one thing that we can say about this type of approach, which makes a lot of sense, is that the public usually doesn't like it. They don't like to think of policymakers, sort of mucking around and trying to find the right thing. That doesn't sound like crisis leadership at all. So that's the big discrepancy here, I think. So in general, if I round that up, I think that sometimes we have to be careful that by talking about evidence-based and getting better evidence, this and the other, that we're not telling the truth to policymakers, which in the end is that they will have to make decisions without having enough information. Their normal sort of reflexes and procedures and practices that they use in negotiating complex problems, even in a dynamic environment, are not going to work in this particular environment. And and then I'll end there, is what I always find with policymakers is the shadow of accountability is very present. They will say, they will start thinking about how, in hindsight, things will be perceived, the decisions that they make. And in hindsight, we all know everything will be known with the hindsight bias. So we just tell our policymakers, whatever you decide, you're going to be screwed anyways. Because, any inquiry is going to find that this was not the best decision. There was a better decision. I mean, you would, if you can get the right decision in a crisis, you should be buying lottery tickets, because that's the equivalent of it. So it's a bit rambling, but I think it's a bit of a different approach. So we should that should be good for discussion.
The questions are starting to come into the chat. I'll just make a couple of comments, then I'm going to kick off with a sort of question to each of you before we open up. As you just said, one of the problems with crises is each new crisis is different from the past ones, and therefore, by definition, the evidence is partial, imperfect, doesn't quite fit. There's a wonderful piece from quite a long time ago by Malcolm Gladwell, who's not a social scientist, but it looks at the problem that almost any major crisis like in warfare or terrorism, there will always have been lots of information and warning signs which were ignored in the benefit of hindsight, but then you don't notice all the other information which was misleading, which had to be ignored. So this is always a challenge. In the UK, we have 2 public inquiries underway now, which are very interesting in relation to our topic. One is the inquiry on COVID, which will carry on for years to come, but which is showing in some ways the difficulty of all these often very sophisticated networks of evidence, but feeding into the middle of government. There was a real struggle to make the most of them, for the politicians to understand it, for their most senior decision makers not to be a little bit biased by their own backgrounds, etc. So there's a sort of live interpretation underway. And a strange, very different example, which won't be familiar to anyone outside the UK, is an inquiry into the Post Office Horizon scandal, which actually I gave evidence to, but where at a certain point, I think a couple of weeks ago, the government suddenly felt it had to bring in an entirely new policy within a matter of 2 or 3 days. So this was one of Eleanor's examples, which was sort of exogenous, but largely political. It wasn't a natural disaster or a pandemic or a financial crisis, but it was experienced as intense pressure to come up with a solution very, very quickly in response to public demands and media pressure. So I wanted to kick off with 3 questions to each of you. Perhaps you don't have to answer all of them, but some thoughts on this. The first, which has been raised by our participants, is what can you do to prepare better? If you had a free hand, you were in charge of the government machine, what can be done to lay the ground for potential crises so the use of evidence is more efficient? That's question number 1. And recognizing that you'll never predict exactly what the form of the crisis will be. Secondly, on this issue of making a judgment about when do you act or when do you seek more knowledge before you act, is this just a matter of hunch or craft, or is there any science of how you make that trade-off? Is there anything more systematic which can be done to guide that judgment about, as it were, the costs of omission or the costs of commission? And then finally, a question which is mainly much to Arjun, but also perhaps to all of you. You describe the difference between strategic and operational, but often in a crisis, the politicians at least feel a pressure to be both. And they are held to account for the operational side of the crisis as well as the strategic, and feel they have to, dive into the midst of it in order to be credible. So how do you handle that imbalance when often they won't be very well placed to make operational decisions? And in a rational world, they leave all of that to the police, the fire services, the military, whatever. And yet they feel they are held to account, not just for the strategic, but also for the operational. So maybe if we go around, Eleanor, Carrie, and then Arjun, some thoughts on those. And then please, everyone taking part online, please put comments into the chat, put questions, put links to what you think are interesting examples or materials to help illuminate us. Eleanor, over to you first.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. I'll focus on the first one and let others maybe take the other two. But particularly around what can you do to prepare better, because this has been something that's come out in the inquiries, is how woefully unprepared government were and how slow they were to pick up how the seriousness of the crisis. And you see throughout the process, throughout the experience of the pandemic, a lot of harking back to the flu pandemic around the First World War, and how far back you had to go to kind of really understand that these things can get up to that scale. A couple of things just about how to prepare better. I think there's a tendency to imagine it's about setting up plans and drills the same way you would with an operational crisis. But I think that's a fool's errand. You really couldn't actually do that process for all the potential scenarios that could create a crisis for government. For example, we mentioned 9/11 a couple of times. It was very unlikely you're going to hit that exact scenario and the scale of it and the specificity of the drivers and that sort of thing. So on that basis, like the thing that we know helps evidence-based policy along, there's a couple of really great meta-analyses on this, is the close relationship between the evidence generators and the decision makers. So it might be researchers and policy makers, but sometimes those evidence generators sit inside or outside government. And so building those relationships is quite intangible. And this is really sort of where I sort of highlight that institutional culture is there needs to be some sense that there's value in knowing the experts and being connected in the experts and having an ongoing dialogue with the people who really study these sorts of topics deeply. So if you work in the agriculture space, know all the people who research agricultural disasters. And if you work in the health space, know the people who've been really focused on what to do when a health system fails. And then probably the next layer on that is the sort of infrastructure, which I think Carrie was pointing to quite a bit, about that idea of investing in brokers. Make sure you do have that glue in the system that can help make that bridge, even if individuals don't have those relationships, that you've got people who know where to look for evidence, know how to translate it, know how to digest it and communicate it in really effective ways. So highly stressed, highly time poor senior decision makers aren't fishing around for the people who can help them, that those people have a role and have a place in your systems and institutions. There'd be the two things I'd point to on that front.
Thanks, Eleanor. And over to you, Carrie, maybe just add into that, one thing which many governments do is using simulations and games and so on as a way of preparing for crises, to get almost the emotional feel of what it will be like, which is very different from the cognitive sort of analysis of crises. One of the problems in the UK, they used to do a lot of those on pandemics, and then about 5 or 6 years ago, they sort of stopped. Slightly unfortunate timing, but there is an argument, unless you have some preparation of that kind, you will panic a little bit when the real crisis hits. But Carrie, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I second Eleanor's points, and agree with what she said. And just in terms of a few other points, I mean, yeah, very much agree on the sort of real value of sort of exercising, but also recognizing that they're also incredibly resource intensive as well. And so the need to sort of look at other ways of building in that knowledge. And one of the things that we've been thinking that's part of the work that we're doing as well is building capacity within government. So building, sort of developing new training, both for practitioners, so sort of the in-house social and behavioral scientists, but also for resilience teams and policy teams to sort of ensure that you do have some of And again, there's that sort of tension between the sort of where's the line between the operational and the sort of science, and I think it's always a bit of a blurred line. But again, sort of that sort of peacetime preparation, trying to sort of upskill and build capacity. And then I think there's also, I mean, this is one of, obviously one of the sort of things that's incredibly valuable during the emergency is having that sort of real-time data and real-time evidence. And I think including, there's a comment in the chat, sort of qualitative evidence is incredibly important, and I think is often undervalued in government for various reasons. But alongside that, the deep expertise of people who can spot the sort of wider patterns. So people who have been working in this area of infectious disease or for, sort of emergency, public response and emergencies from a behavioral perspective, and can sort of make those connections. So I had a sort of interesting conversation with a researcher yesterday who was talking about, there were patterns in terms of influenza vaccine, which were very similar to sort of patterns that around vaccine hesitancy during COVID. But because again we didn't have that sort of long view, or at least weren't able to sort of, I think again because of the rapid aspect of the of the sort of the context itself, it's so important to sort of bring in the sort of longer term view. And then let's see what else. Again, I guess the sort of one of the points as well is again an intrinsic tension is, having those sort of existing networks, but also making sure that you're not just going to the usual suspects. So how do you build in a diversity of viewpoints, whether that be including sort of diversity of thought and background and discipline into, which is hard at the best of times because there's, so much amazing research out there. But in a sort of emergency or sort of rapid context, it's even more, so just tend to go to the usual suspects even more than you normally would. So again, thinking in advance about all of these questions.
Thank you, Carrie. And Arjun, over to you.
Well, what can I add? Let me just say one of the things that I constantly run into when we work with policymakers is that they just find it super hard to make an important decision without having the information that they would like to have. And I can't stress that enough. And so the reflex to get more information is so ingrained that one of the first things in my mind that needs to happen is to educate policymakers, and that can be done through games and simulations, and that makes it more real. That, a crisis is that moment that you're going to have to make the call, and you're going to have to make it, and it's just too bad you just won't have that information. And I'll skip right to that operational strategic, because if you fall in that trap by wanting more information, you're launching yourself into the operational domain, because that's where that information supposedly is. So there's this idea that at the end of the rainbow, which happens to be then somewhere in ground zero land, there's that pot of information, and there's just these operators that are just too stubborn, or they're working against you and they won't give it. If you just immerse yourself, you'll go get it. You just go there, you go get it. And that just gets you out of the strategic groove. It's not going to get you anything. It's going to annoy people, operational people who are doing a job. But most important, it's not going to solve anything, because that information simply doesn't exist. And it will come at some point, but not now when you need it. And that's existential to policymakers. And if you can't deal with that, and we're talking to, there's many policymakers here, so they should, this whole paradigm, more information is better. That's what we live in, the rational sort of world. You're in Alice in Wonderland, and you're down the rabbit hole, and there's different rules there. And if you don't understand that, you're going to fall back on procedures that are going to work against you. Okay, so that's it.
Thank you. And yeah, more information may just mean more chaos, confusion, and noise anyway. We've got some great questions in the chat, so maybe I might ask you each to pick one of them from a couple from Zenda about some of the trade-offs. How do you handle the problems of quick but superficial and misleading evidence and relate that to longer-term science? From Natalie on the division of labor between the research people and the policy people. Is there a clear division of labor? Should they be in integrated teams in crises or not? From Joel, this question of sometimes the bias to the quantitative, when maybe often it's tacit knowledge, qualitative knowledge is as useful in these conditions of uncertainty. Who would like to pick on one of those? Eleanor, maybe start with you. You choose which.
Yeah, look, I was particularly interested in that one about the bias towards quantitative because I've been involved in a lot of discussions about this one, and I actually think that the matter of the at the heart of the matter is of the trusted advisors. They often have a stronger toolkit in one or the other. So while there are some situations where the quantitative advisors are more trusted, and I do think in some situations, say for COVID, that modelling and forecasting crew who could confidently say something about how to get numbers down based on their models, which felt like something more tangible than, say, some of the behavioural studies that were going on, which I think honestly some of them were probably quite quick and dirty, which did make people sort of think, well, I feel like this is more solid evidence that I'm playing with. But I think if you've got, if we can start getting that demand side right, where there's people who understand the full toolkit and understand how the different tools can answer different kinds of questions, you'll do a better job of saying, well, look, in this case, if we're asking how people are going to respond and behave, that is really a qualitative question, and we need to find some qualitative sources to give us some insights here. Whereas, do we think making this particular control on people's movement will get numbers down by a certain amount? That is a quantitative question, and it is worth engaging the modelers and forecasters. So I don't think it's necessarily that across the board one type of evidence is valued over another. But what I do think you sometimes have clearer voices on the advisory side or limited toolkits on the demand side, which means you'll ask for specific things because it's what you know how to ask for.
Thank you. And Carrie, again, pick one of the questions you'd like. And I think also the last one about accountability is interesting. Is it necessary in a crisis, maybe not to worry too much about accountability, to recognize that will come later with inquiries and so on, and the priority is to act, and possibly where too much transparency may even be counterproductive as a team is grappling with very difficult decisions? What's the optimum level of visibility and accountability in a crisis?
I'll take that one. Although also again on the qualitative question, I think certainly I mean my experience is, I think I mentioned this before, that sort of quantitative is usually sort of trusted more, but I think we're trying to sort of encourage as much, the sort of horses for courses approach in terms of actually looking at the research question and then sort of choosing a methodology based on what's most appropriate. On transparency, I mean, during the COVID response, we published all of the sort of scientific advice that was all the papers that went to SAGE as well as the SAGE minutes. And I think, that it's really, I think that's sort of that's the emphasis on transparency is really important in terms of also trust and being able to know what is that sort of scientific base and sort of open it up to public scrutiny and challenge. I mean, equally though, the science advice was being published, and so then of course there's more scrutiny as well because people sort of can see and sort of can go through, but. I do think it's really, really fundamental for to sort of have that that broader sort of public deliberation and transparency around the scientific and research that's feeding into the response, for that to be there and when at all possible in the public domain.
So even if the experts are saying bring in some incredibly draconian measure, lock lots of people up, lock everything down, which might create a massive media hysteria, you would still favor that being visible?
I mean,
That's
it's a bit tricky, and but I think it's just to sort of reiterate the importance of having public trust in the sort of
yeah.
the research that's feeding in.
Yeah. And there's one other little question to you. So the UK has a national risk register, which is published every year, which has an incredible list of terrible things which might happen. This links a bit to Charlie's question in the chat. Is there, as it were, a ready-made map of who the advisors or brokers might be if each of those crises materialized? If anyone hasn't read this risk register, it's worth a look. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of things which might go horribly wrong. Or is it that when each crisis comes almost from scratch, you have to create the right pool of advisors, evidence generators, and brokers? Or is that work done as part of the risk management process? That's one for you, Carrie. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so yeah, that I mean that's absolutely we have we have a sort of a list of experts, but it's also a sort of I mean it's not a sort of static list. So we're constantly sort of thinking about, again, you know, do we have the right diversity? Do we have the right disciplines? You know, who else can we be sort of looking to? So it's very much a sort of iterative process in sort of considering what that expertise is.
And
Yeah.
maybe this question to all of you, in so 2024 as opposed to maybe 2014, 2004, is it much easier to actually open up and say, you know, we're looking for anyone who can give insights, as the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology did at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think 1,200 or so academics volunteered their services. So are there new ways of tapping into essentially collective intelligence rather than just who knows who, the traditional government methods? Do you think that will be part of future crises? Maybe Eleanor, is that something in Australia? Do you think, you know, when there's bushfires, do you open up the calls for expertise and inputs, or is it all from existing relationships?
Look, I haven't seen those call outs. I'm conscious it did happen to some degree during the pandemic, just because of the kind of breadth of issues that had to be tackled. The one thing that it doesn't kind of get to, though, is that question of that sort of overarching research, which says it is the relationship and the trusted relationship between advisor and decision maker that really makes all the difference. And that is genuinely hard to tackle, and it is probably the same reason that during crises things do come down to a very small group of people who know each other and are used to working with each other, because it's otherwise there's quite a dance that needs to be done around how you're going to negotiate through a decision and how you're going to decide who sort of makes final calls and that sort of thing. It's very, very hard to get governance that could both look outwards to all the possible people who could be involved while also allowing for efficient decision making to occur. So I think there's scope, and definitely AI and other methods of kind of getting that collective intelligence together give us some hope about getting to the right people. There'd have to be quite a big cultural change to break away from those trusted relationships.
Yeah, and Carrie, yeah.
I was just going to add to that. I mean, absolutely. It's a real sort of balance in terms of the trust that, again, is fundamental in terms of getting the sort of working relationships between researcher and sort of policymaker happening, particularly in rapid context, but also making sure that you have that sort of collective intelligence and diversity of different views. So it's sort of something that we're sort of giving a lot of thought to, but it's not there's no sort of silver bullet, I don't think.
Thanks. And in a way, you are all partly answer to a couple of the questions in the chat. The mobility across the boundaries of academia and government strengthens those relationships, makes it easier to act in a crisis than if they're hermetically sealed. Arjun, could we have a brief comment from you on the Netherlands culture? From outside, we think the Netherlands has a lot of very sophisticated advisory networks, sort of hybrid institutions, half government, half academic, and levels of communication and trust between the different tiers of government, which are maybe harder in the UK or the US and elsewhere. Or are we completely wrong? Do we have a rose-tinted view of your environment?
You may well have, but I think the big lesson from COVID, where of course the policymakers had to rely on experts, and there was available expertise. It's not so much different as in the UK. I think the essence is that a policymaker wants to trust the expert. Policymakers generally do not like to see new faces. They want to work with trusted faces. They want to, Now you have to wonder who those people are. If you've been in government or near government for a long time, are you really the most up-to-date scientist? Who knows? Policymakers don't care. They have no way of measuring the quality or of a. They don't know about H factors or H discord, that article or whatever. They have no idea. They've seen this person for a long time, must be good. And we all know that the problem is with experts. They're human too, and they like to be near power. And when you get near power, then experts, even experts are going to say things just to stay near power. So, and that's I'm afraid that's not just Dutch experts, but it's certainly true for Dutch experts, that they're going to say things that they know they can't say. But they know that the politician wants to hear. And that's the human side of it. And I have no solution for this. But I just want to make sure that we don't treat experts as some, the gods of science who are going to save policymakers from the big crisis. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I think we can all probably agree on that. Look, we're almost out of time. I'm just going to make two final comments, apart from thanking our speakers for really good presentations and comments on all the questions. The first is this session is one of a series we've been running on innovations in evidence. The first one was on large language models and their role. We've done ones on systems maps. We've done ones on transferability. There's one next month on lived experience and evidence. So all of those are available on YouTube. And the first one, which was about AI, I think is relevant to what Arjun just said, because it is increasingly possible to do quick scans and syntheses using automated tools, and indeed to show if governments are using the right evidence. My colleague Basil Mahfouz works on this, including looking at H indices and so on. Are they often using the most visible evidence, not the highest quality or the most relevant? So there's a bunch of new tools. So it's human and perhaps automated and online capacities, which are different from in the past. And finally, I remember years ago, the head of the British Civil Service saying he had done an exercise in the 70s, which tried to map all 300 crises which might hit the UK in the next 10 years, and none of them happened, but lots of other ones did happen. And kind of the general point there is you can't predict crises, but it's these capacities of resilience, the underlying relationships, the abilities to quickly mobilize expertise of all kinds is key, rather than believing you can plan. And probably one of the risks of the COVID inquiry is it will make everyone prepare really well for a future COVID pandemic, but that's of course not the crisis we will in reality face. So thank you all very much for joining us. And it is bang on 11 o'clock here in the UK. So I will you get on with your day. And I'm sure this is a topic which is not going to go away. We are supposedly in the era of permacrisis or polycrisis. So sadly, this is a growth industry, which we're talking about this morning. Thank you all and take care.